All right. Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to the third webinar in the RENC Accelerating Collaborative Team Science webinar series. I'm Brandy Farlow. I'm a research proposal and documentation specialist at RENC, and I'm currently pursuing my PhD in leadership and really thinking about components of collaborative team leadership and its applications to team science. So today we have Dr. Dorothy Carter with us, and I'm very excited to introduce her to you. But first, we want to highlight just a couple of housekeeping items. So here is a quick overview of our agenda. We'll take just a moment to introduce you to our guest speaker and hear more about the work that she's involved in. We'll spend some time learning with Dr. Carter during her presentation, and then we'll jump into a conversations based on your questions and feedback. Now, you will note we have disabled Zoom Q&A for attendees. Instead, all questions related to the panel should be uploaded to Easy Retro, which is our crowdsourcing Q&A platform. So we'll share the link in the Zoom chat, and you can access it there. Now, you may find the platform intuitive and easy to use, and if so, you are certainly welcome to add questions and comments throughout the panel discussion. But please do note that we will share instructions and the link again after our moderated discussion. So without further delay, I'd love to introduce you to Dorothy Carter. Welcome, Dr. Carter. Would you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey, Brandy, it's so great to see you and see all the participants on call. My name is Dr. Dorothy Carter. I'm an associate professor of organizational psychology and management at Michigan State University. And I'll tell you a little bit more about research here in a second, but I'll let Brandy continue on with the intro presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So now that we've introduced ourselves, let's take a quick look at how we define team science. So many folks use this definition. This is from the National Cancer Institute. Team science is a collaborative effort to address a scientific challenge that leverages the strengths and expertise of professionals, oftentimes trained in different fields. Although traditional single investigator-driven approaches are ideal for many scientific endeavors, coordinated teams of investigators with diverse skills and knowledge may be especially helpful for tackling complex scientific and societal problems. All right, so let's get digging into leadership considerations in collaborative team science. Dr. Carter, the floor is now yours.
Great, let me go ahead and share my slides. All right, can everyone see that? Great. So again, my name is Dr. Dorothy Carter. I'm a researcher at Michigan State University, and my research program focuses on leadership and teamwork and what we call multi-team system functioning. So that's big systems composed of multiple groups of teams that have to interact interdependently to achieve some sort of big picture goal. And I study these concepts in a variety of organizational contexts, including the military, medicine, traditional corporations, scientific collaboration, and space exploration, among others. And so my research kind of leverages a lot of different approaches, including controlled laboratory experiments with human subjects. I do interviews and survey-based studies with employees and organizations. Sometimes we do agent-based computational modeling, where we kind of project out what might happen in these complex systems of people. And so my research program has been funded by a variety of agencies, including NSF, NIH, Department of Defense, and NASA. So for example, right now I have a project going on with NASA that's designed to help support the collaboration needs that are going to be required for these really long duration exploration missions like Moon to Mars. So NASA is one of these organizations that relies heavily on teamwork. But they have current operations that are designed for their current mission demands, like the International Space Station, for example. And those mission demands are going to have to change. The way that they work together collaboratively is going to have to change when they head to deep space destinations like Mars, where there might be an extreme communication delay. For example, when a crew is out close to the surface of Mars, it might take 20 minutes for a message sent from the crew to ground to reach ground. So imagine they say, Houston, we have a problem, and that takes 20 minutes to get there. And then Houston says, what is it? And that takes another 20 minutes. So the way that they do things right now is going to have to change. And so they work with researchers like myself to help prepare their collaborative interactions for those kind of missions. But NASA is one of these examples of a situation like Brandy was describing, where what they do every day is combine expertise from different disciplines to solve really complex problems. So it's not unlike what we are talking about today in the team science context. So to get back to team science, my research does kind of consider team science context as a place to study, but I'm also contributing to a National Academies of Science report on team science, and I've developed and implemented leadership training for high potential scientific leaders when I was previously a faculty member at the University of Georgia. And also I kind of consider this me-search in that I am currently leading or a member of multiple scientific teams that are combining different disciplines together. And so I experience these challenges myself, and the ones that we're going to talk about today, that and try to apply what we know from research on organizational leadership to these situations. And it's very often an imperfect practice in terms of being able to take those lessons learned. So let's go back to the idea of team science in general. So why is it that folks like Brandy and everyone on this call is like, why are we thinking about this? Why is team science important? And so I have several answers for us. One of them is that this is the way that this is the path to scientific impact. So there's research on what's called like the science of team science, sometimes looks at bibliometric indicators of what makes a good paper, or how do people combine their efforts, that sort of thing. And that stream of research pretty definitively shows that some of the highest impact publications that are produced in any area of science were those that combined deep disciplinary expertise from different disciplines in novel ways. So combine physics and chemistry lessons learned from deep experts in those fields, teamed up and merged their ideas together to solve some sort of important problem. And then the other big answer for why do we care about team science is one that Brandy alluded to, which is that the challenges that we're facing as humans on this earth are really complex and interdisciplinary. For example, like the climate doesn't care that we as humans have organized ourselves into different disciplines like geology and et cetera. Those problems are happening regardless of how we think about different areas of science. So addressing these complex 21st century challenges, like pandemics, new product development, emergency response, require collaboration, require interdisciplinary collaboration. And very often it requires collaboration on unprecedented scales. So it's not enough for a single laboratory to tackle some sort of scientific issue that's related to global healthcare. It very often requires multiple laboratories organized into some sort of center, teaming up to address some sort of problem. However, and I think this is why we're all here today and discussing this, is it's really not easy. And in fact, it's very difficult to do this effectively, particularly when the team gets large and increasingly interdisciplinary and more reliant on virtual collaboration tools. We're dealing with differences between each other regarding tenure and promotion requirements, methodological approaches, publishing norms, professional identities, work process differences, kind of the list goes on. And just in general, teamwork is hard. So because of that reality, research on the science of team science suggests that teams very often underperform compared to their potential. And that's particularly true when the team is very large, when it lacks a disciplinary core that's kind of guiding things, or when team members come from many different disciplines and geographic locations. And scientific teamwork underperforming is not a novel phenomenon. And what I mean by that is that there's actually over 100 years of research on teamwork in organizations in general that suggests that teams tend to underperform compared to their potential. And, organizations very often will have a complex problem and they'll say, oh, we need more and more people, that we need to throw a team at the problem and get together and really merge our brains, and that will solve the problem, right? And what they're hoping for with this is that synergy will happen. And so synergy is the idea that the whole is going to be greater than the sum of its parts. So that's what we can think of as the promise of teamwork. But the reality is very often teams underperform compared to the potential based on numerous well-documented what we call process losses. So process losses are things like social loafing, where you put in less effort in the presence of other people. We don't share information very effectively. Sometimes we think too similarly. Sometimes we think too dissimilarly. The list goes on and on. And so what ends up happening is that in order for a team to function effectively, research on teams suggests that team members generally need to have positive feelings about one another and the task at hand. So we need team members to identify with the group, trust each other, feel cohesive, feel supportive of the group goals. We need them to interact with each other appropriately, so coordinate actions, share information, back each other up. And we need them to, at least to some degree, be on the same page cognitively. So they need to have some sort of shared understanding of what the task is and some sort of understanding of who knows what in the team. And yet what we very often see is the peril of teams. Very often team members have insufficient motivation, trust. They don't feel psychologically safe with one another, meaning they don't feel like they can speak up and ask questions. They don't have sufficient kind of positivity about the situation or commitment to the goal. They don't feel necessarily sufficiently cohesive with one another. And then that translates into insufficient coordination behavior. So they don't talk to each other enough. They don't share information sufficiently. Or sometimes they go overboard and they share, they meet every day and nothing gets done. And very often teams suffer from inaccurate understanding of teamwork and task work. So on the left side of the screen, you see what we're kind of hoping for, which is positive affect behavior cognition, meaning feelings, actions, and thoughts. And yet what we very often see are lower levels than ideal of affect behavior cognition. So just insufficient for meeting the needs of the team task demands. And these problems are well documented in small teams, but we see them sometimes exacerbated in large, what we call, again, multi-team systems. So teams that have to work with other teams. And so a lot of times when we're talking about scientific team or like team science or scientific teamwork, what we're really talking about is what organizational researchers like myself would call a multi-team system. So what is a multi-team system? It's like what you see on the screen here is an interdependent group composed of two or more distinct component teams. And those component teams may pursue their own, what we call proximal or team goals. At the same time, they're all bound together by some sort of shared subordinate goal. And this is very often the kind of situation we might be thinking about when you, as a scientist, write a interdisciplinary kind of larger a grant together with multiple other faculty members. So that what I've depicted on the screen here is maybe we have a PI team where these three faculty members who lead separate laboratories, maybe from different disciplines, maybe from different schools, they're all forming a PI team, and then they're also simultaneously leading their own laboratories. This would be one example of what we can think about as a multi-team system. So the pink circles here have maybe more similarity in terms of this could be the psychology team, and this could be the, let's say, an ecology team and a engineering team. I'm just throwing these disciplines out there. So the psychologists all kind of know the same sorts of things. They're trained in similar ways, and they have more similar goals in terms of what kind of publications count for their tenure and what is a typical reward system. The people who are pink have a more similar overlapping sense of what that means. But all of them are needed in order to achieve the goals of the project that this multi-team system has set out to achieve. And organizing work into these sorts of multi-team system structures has a lot of benefits. And that's why we keep seeing them pop up in science, but in so many other disciplines or in so many other areas. Certainly we see them in NASA, but we see them in traditional organizations, the military. tons of places rely heavily on these multi-team system work structures to get important tasks done. And that's because they do offer a lot of benefits. For example, the component teams, those different laboratories, can specialize in different things. And that's why they were brought together in the first place. They can divide and conquer on different goals that are needed to address some sort of big picture superordinate goal. And they can focus. They can say, okay, well, we're the psychologists. This is how we're going to address things. We're the ecologists, and this is how we're going to address things. At the same time, just having more people and more laboratories involved in this project provides much more resource capacity and different perspectives. And that's a main reason why they tend to show up in terms of some of the complex problems that we as scientists are addressing. And they're maybe more flexible than traditional organizations. So when you propose a center grant, for example, you're not necessarily proposing a forever in-place organization like the universities that we might be housed in. You're saying this is a temporary, flexible organization. Teams can come and go as needed, and therefore it's more flexible than traditional organizations. So anyway, to recap, multi-team systems have a number of benefits, including the ability for teams to specialize, the increased resource capacity, and increased flexibility. At the same time, there are numerous challenges associated with the teamwork processes that are needed to support their supernet goal accomplishment. So just the fact that there are more people and more laboratories sets up it's more complex for us to handle as people. There's more people to know. It's almost impossible when you get a really large center grant for everyone to know all 50 other people in that group. And then it's more difficult for the individuals, but it's also more difficult to know like how you should be interacting with one another, who you should be interacting with. And what we end up seeing a lot of times in these systems is either one extreme or the other. So in terms of how people are interacting with one another. So over here on the left-hand side, we see a pattern of interaction. So these are individuals, and the arrows between them indicate who's kind of coordinating or communicating with whom. And over here, we see it's insufficient to meet the needs of the task. On the other hand, we sometimes see this where it's inefficient. This is a system where everybody's meeting with everyone all the time. Maybe it's demotivating at some point to say like, oh my gosh, I have to be in 50 meetings for this project, and I don't feel like I'm particularly relevant to most of them. So one major challenge of multi-team systems is that it's just more complicated cognitively, and then you don't quite know what to do. And then another major challenge of multi-team systems is the fact that we've organized people into separate groups with much more similarities within the groups than you do between the groups. So they might be different laboratories, might be different specialties, that kind of thing. And what we know about people is that when you organize people into separate groups, we tend to start creating what's called like an in-group, out-group attitude structure, where we see people in our own groups as members of our in-group, and people in other groups as members of the out-group. And those kind of boundary enhancing forces can be exacerbated when the teams are very different. For example, when there's very different knowledge and skills between the groups, when they have different priorities or norms, and when they just don't know each other very well, when there's ambiguity about each other's activities. So all of this to say, these problems that we see in small teams very often are exacerbated in larger multi-team system work structures. So things like distrust, out-group perceptions between teams, coordination breakdowns between teams, and misunderstandings are quite pervasive in multi-team system contexts. So what I'd like to talk to you all about for the rest of today's webinar is the fact that multi-team systems, well, scientific teams, but especially multi-team systems, need effective leadership in order to really get the task done. But I think that's something that people say a lot, like, oh gosh, we need effective leadership. But I want to take apart and kind of like step back and say, well, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be an effective leader, particularly in a team or multi-team system context? And I want to start with the idea that what leadership is at its core is motivation. So according to Katz and Kahn, 1978, leadership is the influential increment above and beyond mechanical compliance with routine directives of the organization. There's a lot of jargon in this statement, but what they mean is that every one of us has kind of our job description, either in our heads or explicitly stated. But what leadership is, it's an interpersonal influence process that motivates people to go kind of above and beyond what they'll just do naturally. So leadership is an interpersonal process between people. And what that process does is it motivates some sort of effort. Okay, but then what is motivation? Motivation, formally defined, is the set of internal and external forces that determines the direction, intensity, and persistence of effort. Meaning motivation is whatever forces, including your leader that you're working with potentially, that determines where you're headed, how much effort you're going to put into that direction, and for how long. So if leadership is motivation, is a motivational influence process, then effective leaders are going to be people who motivate the people they work with, the teams they lead, the multi-team systems they lead, to exert sufficient and persistent effort in the desired direction. So in your case, as potential leaders of scientific teams, you do need to think about what is that desired direction. So what is the goal or goals that you and your team members are driving for? Publications, patents, societal impact, those are kind of tangible outcomes that you might have in your head as like long-term objectives. But in the meantime, in order to achieve those long-term objectives, you also now know that your teams and your systems are going to need to engage in some sort of positive feelings and thoughts and behaviors in relation to one another. Because if they don't, then they're not going to achieve those tangible outcomes that you might be driving for. So to summarize this kind of synthesis of the literature on leadership and motivation, leadership is defined as interpersonal influence processes that motivate people to kind of go above and beyond. And in the context of teams and multi-team systems, the direction we want them to go is towards whatever tangible outcome you want them to achieve. So, the publications, the scientific advancement, scientific impact, societal change, that sort of thing. And in order to get there, you're going to want to make sure that they have positive feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. So your job as a leader is to motivate people, teams, and systems to exert sufficient and persistent effort to like one another, to trust one another, to behave appropriately, to have some sort of shared cognition so that they achieve the desired direction that you're driving for. And what I've done in the next several slides is try to distill. There's a really large literature on what motivates people. So I've tried to distill that literature on what motivates people to these three buckets that we all can kind of handle that are specific places where like leaders have the potential to pull these levers to help motivate their teams and systems. So I'm going to call these motivators purpose, people, and provisions. So when we think about what motivates people, one of the most motivating factors that we have as people is some sort of compelling purpose. So we are motivated when we are compelled to go in a particular direction because it's evoking interest, attention, or admiration in a powerfully irresistible way. So one of your very first jobs as a leader, so say you are somebody who wants to establish a new center grant that is about neurological diseases or something, you are going to need to think long and hard about, like, why is this an important goal? How can I make it as compelling as possible to as many audiences as possible? And I think as scientists, we become quite adept at articulating a compelling narrative around our research that we can tell kind of a general audience. Like if we over time learn to speak with members of the media or, funding agencies or like external sources that say, like, listen, it's really important that we pursue X, Y, and Z scientific endeavor. One thing I think we have relatively less practice at is convincing other scientists who might also have their own compelling purposes to work together on a shared compelling purpose. I worked for several years with like high potential scientists at the University of Georgia on developing their like leadership skills. And some of them revealed to me that they had never really thought about the fact that, like, although they were particularly passionate about their area of research, the people that they might be working with were not not even close to as passionate about that topic as they were. So I think that's really what I'm talking about here, is that yes, you all have really important, compelling purposes that are driving you, but you need to figure out how that compelling purpose that you have can also be compelling to the people that you want to work with. And the reason why that's so important is that research on motivation, on human motivation, suggests that people only put in effort in the workplace if they actually value the outcome and reward. So what's compelling to you may not be compelling to your teammates. And you may not realize that, because we suffer from what's called the false consensus effect, which is that people overestimate the degree to which the way you think and feel is shared by those around you. So what that means is that leaders often assume that, like, what they want is also what their team members want, and that's not necessarily true. So the lesson here is that step one, get to know your people. So really have, especially with your co-PIs on a big project, find out what matters to them. Don't assume that it's what matters to you, and really get to know it and document it if you want to have like a long-term relationship working with somebody, and make sure that whatever priorities of the project that you're working on also align with those other team members. Get a little bit more in detail about this when you're articulating what the purpose of the project is. It's research on goal setting suggests it's good to make sure that the purpose is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, so that you can read more about that on the internet about SMART goals. But going beyond that, I think it's really important that goals are discussed early, regularly, and that everyone knows them. So I've worked with some leaders of like NSF ERC proposals, for example, and when it's important that everyone at all levels of your kind of mini organization, from graduate students on up to PIs, that everyone should know why they're there, that everyone should be able to articulate the purpose. And I think it's because it's motivating to have a clear and articulated purpose. But also our research on multi-team system performance demonstrates empirically that multi-team systems perform more effectively when the leadership team, they get on the same page, they have a shared and accurate understanding of what the task is and how different teams should interact. And then they go ahead and communicate that. They engage in what's called strategic communication regularly, clearly, and often to members of the other component teams, so that they all know, so they're all on the same page about what they're there to do and how to do it. Okay, so let's go back to this model. So what I'm talking about right now is the fact that you all are learning about leadership, and you all are leaders of small or large groups, I'm sure. And eventually your goal here is to produce some tangible outcomes. we know from research on small and large teams that in order to produce those tangible outcomes, teams need to think, feel, and behave in certain ways. And so that's the direction you want to motivate them to go in. And I'm providing 3 buckets of what you can think about as your motivators. So the first one we just talked about is the purpose. And then now let's go on to people, and then we'll talk about provisions. So when I say people, I mean that people are motivated based on who they are, based on what you do as a leader, based on who they are as a person, and based on the group situations that they're embedded in. So let's start with who you are as a leader. Research on what makes an effective leader suggests that there's various leadership styles that people can engage in. So just kind of the way that they approach interactions with their team members. On the one end of the extreme here, we have what's called like a laissez-faire leadership, which is like a hands-off approach. That's shown to be really the most ineffective form of leadership. So sometimes people think it's going to be effective to be like, oh, I'm just going to like let you all run things, and it's feeling like you're empowering them. But in fact, what empirical research suggests is that that means your team is also going to model your behavior and do nothing also. So it's better to be a hands-on leader than it is to be a totally hands-off leader. But as you're becoming more hands-on, you could be kind of like a micromanager leader. That's also not particularly effective. Or you could be an inspiring and motivating and intellectually stimulating leader that gives the impression to your team members that you trust them, that you value their expertise, and you want to develop who they are as people. And that's really what we're talking about when we describe like a leadership style called transformational leadership, which is the idea that you are setting an example of kind of this inspirational person that you'd like everyone to eventually be. You're leveraging positivity and inspirational language. You're getting to know your people, and you're figuring out what they care about and what they, how you can help them grow as individuals. You're providing intellectual stimulation. And again, you're providing a good example. So I am just kind of touching on some of these topics. Every one of these, like transformational leadership, we could do a whole webinar on this topic, but we only have a couple more minutes, so we'll skim through some of these. So the next thing people are motivated by is who they are as people. So it's not just about what you do; it's also about who they are. So individuals are motivated by who they are, and I'm going to break this down into they're motivated by specific extrinsic motivators. Again, we've talked about that. People want to pursue goals that they care about, that are relevant to them specifically, but people are also motivated by what we call intrinsic motivators. So that's the idea that we like to do certain activities for their own sake because it's interesting to us. So that's another reason why, again, you should get to know your people. You need to figure out what are these opportunities that they would find particularly interesting. What's a good fit with their personalities and their skills and their expertise? Because again, people won't put in the effort unless it's heading towards the direction that they want to go in. And one thing that most of us enjoy intrinsically is learning and providing and gaining new experiences and kind of figuring, that's how we develop our own sense of self-esteem. Sense of self is to grow and develop as a person. And so one thing that leaders can do to target this is provide opportunities for learning and development. So I just threw this one up there as one potential. There's quite a bit out there about like what competencies team scientists might need, that could be an opportunity to provide a learning experience to your team members that might be particularly intrinsically motivating. And what I mean by that is like providing opportunities to engage in team science training to develop those competencies so they feel more confident in their ability to do that. So people are motivated by the leaders they work with, like who they are and how they act. They're motivated by themselves, like what is intrinsically motivating to them as people. And they're also motivated by the group situations that they're embedded in. So some groups are just more motivating than others to be a member of. What we like as people is to be affiliated with members of successful groups that are supportive and positive. So groups where we feel like a sense of belonging and trust and cohesion, where we feel like things are fair and equitable and just, and there's like a sense of inclusion and accessibility. So these are all characteristics of groups that, you know, you're heading towards a more likely successful outcome if you establish group situations that have higher trust and cohesion and equity. So the lesson here is for leaders to regularly communicate about what the group is and how it is. So establishing a very clear group identity, saying like, we are like this, our group behaves this way. Reward those wins. We like to be members of successful groups. So really recognizing individual and group successes, reward group collaboration, articulate fair and equitable rules, certainly no tolerance for hostile or abusive behaviors, use appropriate feedback, giving and receiving strategies. So in general, what I'm talking about in terms of like the P for people is that people are motivated by being affiliated with groups that are positive, like by positive social environments. And then the third thing people are motivated by is when they believe that putting in the effort can in fact lead to the desired rewards. So imagine a situation where you really want that the tangible outcome that you think that this team could achieve. And you really like these people so much, like you really enjoy working with them as humans, but you just don't think it's going to be possible because you don't have the right funding, you don't have the right support system, you don't really know how to do it. So that's going to prevent you from, even though you want that goal, and even though you like these people, you're still not going to work very hard because you don't believe it's possible. And so that's why the third thing that leaders really need to pay attention to is, are the right provisions or resources in place in order for teams to achieve their goals together? So you could think about it as like financial resources. So certainly it's important to seek out the financial support needed to carry out your research. It's especially important in large complex systems. My research suggests that in larger systems, it's less likely for people to work together if the funding is like really unstable, for scientific teams to work together if the funding is unstable and kind of comes and goes, because you just don't know if it's going to be there next year. It's important to have the human resources in place, so meaning like the people with the right skills and expertise to do the task. But then what I'm going to focus on is the idea that it's also important for the teams, or especially the systems, to have the right social resources in place. Meaning that people understand what they need to do, they know how to interact with one another, the work is structured and organized effectively. Going back to that picture I showed you before, a lot of times, especially in big groups, they either under collaborate or over collaborate. So it's important for you as a leader to articulate like how much interaction, who needs to work with whom, when. It's also important to have liaisons designated who can kind of cross-train between different groups and learn the language and learn how the different groups behave, so that the teams can start developing an understanding of like who knows what and how to achieve a goal together. And I think the take-home lesson here that I'm going to end with is that in order to get there, in order to develop the social resources that you need, very often leaders need to put in place some best practices for supporting team performance. So things like developing a team or multi-team system charter, conducting regular self-assessments and team debriefs. What I mean by a multi-team system charter is some sort of collaboratively developed document that says like, here's who we are, here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to do it. I actually provided a link here to a charter template that I created a while ago that can be used as a starting place if you're going to run a big scientific interdisciplinary grant, for example, and you want to have a kickoff meeting. This could be an initial point of discussion, like a departure point, that you can start saying, like, okay, what is it that we are doing today? What do you care about? What do I care about? How am I going to contribute? How are you going to contribute? What are our publishing norms? What are our performance standards? That sort of thing. What are any anticipated issues and tensions? And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that doing this early and like really articulating these questions can help teams perform much more effectively. Another idea is that my team has done quite a bit of is to conduct periodic assessments. So this is something that we've done with large center grants, is we conduct, yearly assessments of how scientific multi-team systems are functioning. We might ask about how team members feel about one another. We might ask about how they think the goals are structured, like what are the important priorities of the system. And in this NIH Center grant that we did this, that the data is from on this page, we found that although the leadership team thought that the whole grant had certain priorities, other teams didn't know those priorities. So that's kind of a learning opportunity. And we can map patterns of interaction, then match to see like whether those are actually matching the way that the PI team members think things should go. And then the final idea that, the final best practice I wanted to highlight is the idea that really effective teams and multi-team systems engage in periodic debriefs, which are meetings to do some self-reflection about how things are going. What did we learn? What could we do differently? And, making sure that these meetings are very safe and people feel open and honest during them. So in summary, what I wanted you to take away from this talk is that your job as a leader of an interdisciplinary scientific team, and especially a multi-team system, is to make sure you really understand what we're driving for, which is the multi-team system success outcomes. Understand that in order to get there, people need to trust one another, so they need to have positive affect, they need to engage in particular behaviors, and they need to have a shared understanding of the team and task. But in order to encourage people to go in that direction, you as a leader really need to be aware of what motivates other people. And so to distill all of the research on motivation into these three buckets, what motivates people is to have a compelling purpose that they care about, is to be in a positive social environment, and to have the provisions needed in order to achieve the goals that they want to achieve. All right, and that's it. I guess we can go ahead and open up. Brandy, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that very interesting conversation. We would actually at this point like to hear from everybody in the audience. So we'll move on to an easy retro board. Our RENC colleague, Leah Mason, will now walk us through how to use the board, which is our Q&A platform.
Hello, everyone. It seems like many of you have already figured this out, but the link is in the chat and will be added again shortly. You can add your questions here. We do have a couple subject headers that you can add under, or miscellaneous. What we're going to do is answer questions, trying to see the ones that have been liked or upvoted most. Once they've been answered, we will move them off to the answered question column. Maybe you don't have a question, but you enjoy that area or topic, or have resources or thoughts on it. You can also add comments here for others to see. And what we'll do is Brandy will be asking the questions, Dr. Carter will be giving her responses, and we'll move through as many of these as able. Back to you, Brandy.
All right, so we'll kick this off with the first question here. What do you see as the needs for leadership development in team science? How might we move the needle in this area?
Great. Yeah, I think, as scientists, I think we're asked to do so much already. Like I remember being an assistant professor and realizing that I suddenly also needed to have expertise in marketing and in website design and hiring, firing, training graduate students. Like there's a lot that maybe wasn't the focus of our graduate school education. So I think that being part of programs like this is a really good thing. It's kind of like this lifelong career development thing. That I do think that this is something that universities should invest in terms of like supporting faculty members and supporting team science potential leaders. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but
okay, I think you answered it pretty well. The next question kind of follows up on this, so I'll ask this too because I think it'll elaborate a little more on that. What are available leadership training options for collaborative scientists?
Yeah, My sense right now is that it's a little idiosyncratic to what institution you're housed in. I think I'm aware of like some of the kind of national labs have maybe their own internal leadership development track. I was at the University of Georgia previously, and I worked with the provost office to develop some sort of leadership training program for scientists on campus. And then it seems like NC Chapel Hill is doing a similar thing. So I think a lot of this is like emerging within the universities themselves or within places where scientific leaders exist because of the obvious need of like, this is a challenge. There are more like formalized training programs, of course. So like I'm thinking about the Center for Creative Leadership, which is also based in North Carolina. Their whole business model is to develop leaders in organizational context. So there could be an opportunity for institutions to invest in that sort of thing, particularly as the emphasis gets more and more on like big projects that end up being small organizations where leadership is so much more important.
Yeah, absolutely. So next question, how do you think about motivation in terms of these complex collaborations? Is it often that authorship grants are equally credited and shared? Are there any common strategies across collaborations that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question is so interesting and, not easy to answer. I think what we're running up on is this tension between how things used to be and how things currently are in terms of like academic life. I'll just use universities, but obviously team science happens in industry and in national labs and that sort of thing. But like our tenure promotion standards, for example, very often are disciplinary focused. So getting the publications in particular discipline journals, your name recognition within your field. And then suddenly we're asked to team up with people who have extremely different publication outlets, tenure promotion requirements. So, did the question disappear?
No, we moved it over to the answered questions. It's at the top.
Oh, okay.
Right now.
I see. Yeah. I see how it works. This is really helpful. So yeah, I think my suggestion, it goes back to what I was saying in the slides, is that like really getting to know your people from day one, because there are some situations where it's just never going to work out too. Like, and knowing that early, knowing that, you're working with somebody who is only allowed to publish in these 5 journals, for example, might mean that, they're never going to be motivated to work on this chemistry question that I want them to work on. So I do think there's that issue, is like figuring out if there is some sort of opportunity for shared priorities. And then maybe if there are, then we get into more of what this question is also seeming to ask, which is about the authorship, that sort of thing. I feel like that's always a negotiation, even within discipline. So it's even more of a negotiation across disciplines, right? And so common strategies, I think, like becoming really open to the idea that, you might provide the other person with a win at this moment, and then you take a win at that moment in terms of like what your priorities are.
That sounds perfect. So a little bit of give and take there.
Yeah, exactly.
That makes sense. So I guess the next question would be, how can we help guide faculty who are resistant to team science towards some of the principles and habits or processes?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think to some degree, I don't know where it is, but somebody else had a question about kind of training graduate students and like next generation of scientists. I think this is one of these things where we don't need every single person in every organization to be a team scientist too. So some people maybe want to stay within their discipline and do that, right? And I think that is a valuable contribution to science as well. But to go back to the idea that so many of our problems are requiring collaborative team science expertise. I do think that really changing our reward structures within universities to reward contributions to team science is an important part of things. And then also training the next generation of scientists to value it and have the competencies, like the interpersonal competencies that are needed in order to work effectively with people from different disciplines. So it's not necessarily that they have to be able to speak all of the languages of all other disciplines, but it's about kind of this openness to learning and collaborating.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. I did want to just quickly mention the comment on that question also says including allowing their trainees who usually are doing the work to engage with the larger team directly, which was another consideration. I didn't know if you wanted to potentially speak to that as well.
Yeah, so it's like I've heard conflicting arguments about this over the years in terms of like involving trainees across multiple disciplines. I think that it can be a really motivating and exciting learning opportunity to work across disciplines. I have heard the counter argument of like, when you're a brand new trainee, you need to really focus within your discipline and make an impact within your discipline. And then maybe once you've gotten tenure or something, then you can play across disciplines. That potentially that might be too late to learn new skills. So I would err on the side of involving trainees right away in interdisciplinary opportunities, but not allowing them to go overboard on that, because there is a need to develop deep disciplinary expertise so that you can combine it with other people who also have deep disciplinary expertise.
Yes, absolutely. All right, so what advice or resources do you have for leaders in periods of transition? So people inheriting large projects that are maybe deep in bad habits because of missing leadership or other problematic behaviors.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think I've seen presidents of universities incoming presidents of universities do listening tours where they go to each department and really understand what's going on in that department before announcing some sort of strategic plan that reprioritizes everything. So I think like periods of transition could represent enormous opportunities for leaders to redirect, but I think it requires a lot of that like pausing and having the conversations, really getting to know the people that are there, and then reframing. Like, I think it's like a lot of communication after that. Okay, we are now going into a new phase of who we are, and here's how we're going to be, and here's what we're going to do. So I don't think that that's an easy experience, but I do think that from what I've seen in academic leadership, that it is quite possible to redirect a huge ship.
It sounds like a lot of engaging with people and listening to them to try and get it moving forward again.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. I think we only have time for another question or two. I'm gonna just pick this one here on our miscellaneous. What about teams including people with disabilities? How do the pros and perils work when expectations are normative and not inclusive?
Yeah, that's a really important question right now. I mean, I've been learning a lot more about this recently as a member of this team science report that's being generated by the National Academies of Sciences panel. I think there's several experts on there that are focused, their research is focused on accessibility in organizations, particularly in science. And it's really requiring us as collaborators to think differently about like, what are the appropriate norms, and also being open to shifting those norms when new members join the team that have particular needs. So we got to hear from one speaker that isn't really able to leave her house very often because of certain health issues, but she's able to contribute tremendously to the scientific endeavor. And so they've shifted from, hanging out at a rock climbing club, like the lab that she joined has shifted of like, what do they do to establish social bonds? Involves brand new ideas now that she's a member of the team. And instead of hurting the team functioning, that actually helps because it shows that you're open to shifting who we are to accommodate the different needs of the team members that you have. And I think it like really actually strengthened her lab and the research rather than being a problem. And I think a lot of times people might jump to the conclusion like, oh gosh, well, that's going to change who we are. And in fact, that's actually a good thing.
Yeah, that ability to elastically think about things
Exactly.
kind of flows through to other things. All right. Well, I do believe that is all the time we have for questions today. And I'm sorry to cut this off here because it seems like we have a lot of really great questions still in here. But we do have to get moving on. So before we leave, I just want to share a few opportunities to engage in some of the team science efforts you've heard about today. We will be sending out a link to today's slides, so you'll have information via email within a few days. Additionally, the ACTS team will be taking a break over the summer, but our team will still be found engaging in the science, in the team science space. Notably, two of our members, myself and Dr. Julie Horvath, will be presenting a workshop called Successful Collaboration Writing in the Team Science Space. That will happen at the Insights Conference, which runs July 30th through August 1st. Dr. Carter will actually also be presenting on a panel about team science effectiveness there. So it's definitely an event that you do not want to miss. We'll also be announcing our fall webinars and guests and providing additional content about team science theory and practice over the summer. So make sure to join our listserv and ensure you stay up to date. Also, please take some time to just review our past ACTS webinars through our YouTube playlist, and all the links for that will be in our chat. Thank you so much for coming today.
Great. Thank you all so much for attending.